It's our privilege to introduce the next presenter, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Levy. Lieutenant Colonel Levy is a senior psychologist for the Australian Army Aviation. He was appointed as a psychologist to the Regular Army in 1989 and has held a variety of roles in defence, in recruiting, strategic HR, mental health services and support to military operations. He has served in Somalia, Bougainville, East Timor and the Middle East and Afghanistan and has provided support to the Australian government research efforts in the Antarctic. He has a master's degree in organisational psychology from the University of New South Wales, a postgraduate diploma in human factors and safety management systems from the University of South Australia. Lieutenant Colonel Levy's primary focus is on human behaviour in complex and high reliability systems. Today he will speak to us on leadership role clarity and how leadership is a key factor in system performance and safety. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Martin to the stage.
Thanks, Sam, for the introduction. Just excuse me for a minute. I'm just writing to Richard. Send. All right, as a psychologist. So thanks for the opportunity to present today. Some of you might be wondering why you have to look at that guy in his Speedos. I know I've just drawn your attention there. It's a metaphor for swimming in your lane lines and swimming in your lane, which I think is relevant to the topic of role clarity. So today I want to talk about role clarity and its importance. For me, I think it was a bit of a no-brainer, but I understand it has been a contentious issue. And so I really want to explain why the science tells us that role clarity is a really important part of the way that we get business done, which is what our Army is meant to do, and how that impacts the satisfaction and retention of our people, and then sort of segue that into how teams actually work and the importance of role clarity around teams. My background is around human factors and safety management systems. I've been the Senior Safety Advisor for Army Aviation, and I've served on a number of accident investigation inquiries, including the Board of Inquiry for the Sea King accident in Neas Island 2005. So I was able to contribute to the 750 plus findings and 256 systemic and organisational recommendations around how to improve the system around aviation capability in the ADF. The first thing I wanted to do was to review this model that was put up as a recommendation around a definition of role clarity. And as I looked at it, I've got to say I was pretty comfortable with it. I know it's the product of a significant amount of consultation, and I know that the Commandant, I think it's his working definition of role clarity. And so as I went through the science of the literature around role clarity, I can confirm that it's a pretty good model and stands up pretty well. And I want to just run you through that, particularly the people who might be a little bit sceptical and have some concerns about what role clarity brings to our teams and our organisation. The first thing I want to do, though, is to give you an insight as to when I go to an air accident site, Black Hawk 1996, I was in the investigation team for that terrible 12th of June crash, and I was also on the accident investigation team for the loss of our Chinook in Afghanistan in 2011. I use this model. It's the reason accident model, and I think it has an applicability across all systems in Army and the ADF. So on the right-hand side, there'll be a loss of system control, and in my world, that's often an aircraft crash, but it might be unacceptable behaviour, it might be fraud, it might be a leadership failure of some sort. The first thing that I will do, having been to the site and being as proximal as I can be to the loss of system control, is I'll work them back into what were the errors and or violations around the behaviour of people proximal to that loss of control. But we certainly won't stop there. We'll then move back into, were there preconditions for those errors and or violations? Were there conditions that set these people up for the loss of system control? Once we've established that as best we can, our premise is that our preconditions are managed by our supervisors, and so we'll then move back into the supervisory and leadership systems around the incident itself. And then if our leadership systems and our supervisory systems aren't working that well, we'll eventually get into the organisational systems. That's why the Sea King inquiry took 2 years. because it is a complex, defence aviation is a complex system of systems. And you can't spend a couple of weeks just looking into that. It took 2 years and a 1,700-page report to try and explain why 9 people died in Nice on that day. So you can see there, this is the Swiss cheese model. So these things, these pieces of cheese, the metaphor is that they are defences against system loss. And you can see there that leadership and supervision are a key defence against system loss. And so I will get very interested in how our supervisory systems and our leadership were working when we see major catastrophic loss in our systems. And so the slices of cheese will have holes in them just like Swiss cheese. And those holes are dynamic. They move around and they change in size. So if you're thinking about, well, supervision is one of our defences against system loss, and you're carrying vacancies in your supervisory system, or your leadership training isn't as good as it can be, or the behaviour of our people isn't optimal, then those holes in that cheese start to get bigger. And they can appear in places that you weren't expecting unless you're looking. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we're looking within the Army aviation system. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the antithesis of role clarity, which are role stresses, to just give you a sense for what they mean in my world as a psychologist. I'm going to talk about the impact and outcomes. I'm hoping to get through that role clarity piece pretty quickly and then move into this self-correcting team. So I've picked 2 topics today. So self-correcting teams and the influence of key social factors. So there are 2 main role stressors, role ambiguity, and as you can see there, it's the antonym or the opposite to clarity. And it's about uncertainty, about expectation and behaviour and the consequences associated with someone's role. The questions you might ask if you were really trying to investigate this, and we do ask this in the defence system, is do you know what your responsibilities are and do you know what is expected of you at work? And I think the discussion yesterday and more acutely today around developing trust and relationship, if we're getting no to those answers, I don't really know what my responsibilities are and what's expected of me, particularly in that behaviour space, then that is certainly a significant threat to our ability to develop trust quickly and to work effectively as teams and as an organisation. Role conflict, gratuitous aviation slide. Conflict, again, there are 3 parts to that. So that's within the job itself, between jobs, and so when people aren't clear about their roles, they can compete for territory within the same space, which isn't productive for us as an organisation. And then we get back into that belief and expectation about the way the job's being done and the way that I think it should be done, which can create that conflict for people. And so if people are getting incompatible requests within their own system to do the same job, that can create tension and anxiety, and I'll get to that in a moment. So there are 3 major elements to role clarity: understanding the duties, priority of tasks, and I think a lot of what we've been talking about in the last couple of days has been around that behavioural expectation. And so if we cannot be clear on that behavioural expectation, we're already behind the power curve in our ability to generate outcomes. There are great rewards in terms of, and this is from the literature, this is not Martin sitting at his desk at night thinking about the great things that might come from role clarity. There's an enormous amount of literature around role clarity. We talk about accuracy and efficiency. If people know what's expected of them, they can target their outcomes and goals, and they can do that much more efficiently. If you know what your roles are, you can ask for resources around those roles. If you have to work quickly, and I noticed we had some people speaking about flood disasters and multi-agency tasks, you can develop trust very quickly if we have an understanding of those multiple agencies or coalition partners and what roles we will play in generating an outcome. People who are clear on their roles are more highly motivated. They can actually work towards something. We're an optimising species, and so we do like to get stuff done. And so when we have a clear goal and an outcome, we are more likely to move towards those outcomes if we have a strong sense for what they are. And the other part of the literature, the flip side of the literature, is if people are unclear about their roles, if they're in this ambiguous state, if they're in conflict around their roles, they're just not happy at work. And so we also, as leaders, have an obligation to look at the sustainability piece, not just for our tasks today or this year or on the next exercise. It's the sustainability of people and all the things that support them so that they're here next year or in 5 years or in 10 years' time. So it's the sustainment piece and the retention of our people that's important for our organisation. I think one of the questions around this is that the operating environments we have our people are sometimes volatile and chaotic, and doesn't roll clarity, doesn't that hone you into a lane just like that swimming pool without scope to move and be adaptable and flexible, innovative and show initiative? And I think the answer to that is no, it doesn't limit that. In fact, my view is that it actually enhances that opportunity, because what role clarity does is it reduces ambiguity and uncertainty. And I want to talk a little bit about creating the stable platform for innovative thought and some of the brain science around that. Gemma King spoke very eloquently yesterday about brain science, so I'm not going to labour that. But it is really important about how this thing here that dictates all of our behaviour, how that works in an environment of uncertainty. And the blue threat from within. So if we're generating by our own hand uncertainty, ambiguity and conflict, then we are using resources that could be used to deal with the external threat, to generate outcomes for our organisation that we want. So we have, as leaders, the opportunity to reduce that uncertainty, to create clarity, and to take the stress and anxiety associated with those things away and minimise them as much as possible so we can focus on the fight. So Gemma spoke about this yesterday. If you believe in evolution, we came out of the littoral environment as reptiles up into the trees, as mammals, and then eventually onto the savannah plain, stood up straight and said, okay, let's crack on. But this whole thing up here, we know that we saw some great slides yesterday about evolution and cultural change. There's been significant cultural change, particularly in the last 150 years, but certainly as you're as old as I am, looking at the room, probably share the view, with digital age and social media, cultural expectations are changing rapidly now that this whole thing is having trouble keeping up. Again, Gemma really gave a good presentation on this yesterday. I won't labour it, other than to say that neocortex, this prefrontal cortex at the top of your brain here, the lumpy bit, this is the bit that governs the stuff underneath. So it is the behavioural monitor, and that's why we're pretty hard over, and we should be, around fatigue risk management, alcohol management, drug management, stress management, because whilst that was the last thing to come online in evolution, it's the first bit that goes offline under certain conditions. So alcohol use and abuse, drug use and abuse, fatigue and stress. So that's why I think as leaders, we always need to be trying to keep this thing here that makes us human, the top bit that allows us to do symbolic reasoning, allows us to do maths problems, complex operations, to operate multi-ship formations, Tigers and MRHs at low level at night on NVG. We need to keep this in the best shape that we can. So into the social setting, and why is it so important? So my belief is that an army is very much a social undertaking. So we need to understand social science and what drives social behaviour in our systems. Here's a model that I've been using in the aviation system for some time. If you're going to write anything down, I just encourage you to write this model down. So David Rock, an Australian, and did his PhD in the neuroscience of leadership. And so this model that I just read in that book one day, I thought, hey, that sits pretty well with me. I started rolling it out amongst the senior leadership in Army Aviation, and I've been able to present this around a number of units, the pre-command course, and a number of units around the country. And it seems to feel real intuitive. And I see this as a bottom line mechanism about the factors that you really should be thinking about when humans are motivating themselves in a social system. So what Rock's saying is, the big red arrow is that these 5 characteristics, and I'll explain them in a moment, are really important. And when those things are threatened, humans will move away from situations that threaten these 5 elements. And once that's dealt with, the smaller green arrow is that they'll then move towards things that reinforce these 5 elements. So you might say, well, are those elements, are they genuine? Do they fit? I absolutely believe they do, because we put this as an overlay across a number of problems within our system. And you can weight those elements differently. Status is really important to us as a human species, and it's part of our evolution. It is in this room right now. VIPs are sitting at the front. There are stickers there for VIPs. Qantas does it to you, status points. The worst day of my life was when they dropped me from platinum down to gold, I think it was, because they keep putting me on Virgin flights all the time now. So it's in our rank, we wear it. We're very clear about our status and hierarchy within our system. It's more subtle in other workplaces, but it's around us in other places, in the cars that we drive, the houses that we live in, the suburbs, the school that we went to, the school that our kids go to. Little Johnny's now doing state reps. Isn't that fantastic? I don't know, really, I don't care about little Johnny, but you seem to be getting something out of that. So status is really important to us. Status is really important to us, and I suspect that you can remember, because it'll be burned into your emotional memory somewhere in that middle brain. You can remember a time when your status has been attacked, either personally, but even more acutely publicly. And so that stuff hurts when your status gets attacked. Certainty, humans look for certainty. We are the dominant species on the planet because we are highly threat sensitive. We can deal with threats, the old fight or flight. We can deal with them very quickly and rapidly. 2 types of thinking, intuitive thinking and more analytical, deliberate thinking. Your intuitive thinking, within less than a second, you can sum somebody up using your own heuristics, background and belief system. You can assess someone as to whether they're a threat to you or not. And so we look for certainty all the time. And the time that you've probably been most unhappy, anxious, or even depressed, I suspect it was when there's been a lot of uncertainty in your life. And the classic example is a closed book exam that you probably haven't studied for properly. It's on tomorrow morning. And so that anxiety that you feel is a very natural reaction, because humans don't like uncertainty. And we have to compel ourselves as an army to move towards uncertainty. And we know that takes an enormous effort. It takes social cohesion. It takes words like courage. It takes words like bravery and mateship and capability and power to move towards uncertainty, because it's not a thing that we normally and naturally do as a species. Autonomy is really important to us, and so I think we've heard about micromanagement a couple of times over the last couple of days. We don't like being micromanaged, and we don't like having the power to manage our immediate environment taken away from us. We like to be with people that we get on with, and so I suspect there are little cohorts and enclaves of people who get on with each other. They know each other from previous lives, and they're sitting together. I love doing tri-service. I'm seeing a lot of suits up there, but I like doing tri-service things where you'll see the tribes sit together. The white and the blue and the green will sit together because of like and relatedness in their cultures. And then finally, fairness. And I suspect the time that you've felt most angry, when you've felt most frustrated in your life, I suspect there's been a fairness principle here. And I know fairness is in play when I hear people say, the line starts, that's bullshit. And then there'll be a fairness argument after that. So fairness is really important to us. And I see these things all the time within our operational and capability management systems, where these things will play out, because this is the social setting. So the question I think we need to ask ourselves in terms of what climate and culture, the leadership climate and culture, is who gets rewarded? What gets rewarded in your teams? And teams can be at the lowest level. We often want to think about corporals managing sections, but I'm also thinking about colonels managing their capability and generals managing their capability. What's getting rewarded and punished in your team? So we've been through some difficult times culturally within Army. I think we've seen some aspects of our organisation where being a bully, picking on weak people, having a high alcohol culture, they're the things that get rewarded, and frankly, they still do. I see it all of the time. So if that's the stuff that's getting rewarded, people figure out, okay, that's getting socially rewarded, that gives me status within my group, so maybe I'll go out on a heavy night on Friday night and not come back till Sunday, not sleep all weekend. So you've got to ask yourself what's getting rewarded in your teams and what's getting punished. If someone says, hey, let's do this the right way, by the book, this seems like something that we really need to knuckle down in a procedure, that might actually get punished. Well, what do you want to do that for? You know that there's a higher, we've got to get this done quickly. And we start to sacrifice procedure and process because what gets rewarded is, in the Navy's case for Sea-King, was availability of Sea-King aircraft. That was being rewarded. The fact that they may not have been safe or capable at the time, the organisation was rewarding availability of Sea-King helicopters. So what's getting rewarded and punished? And who is meting out that? Because it may not actually be the people who have formal authority or rank in your system. There might be informal leaders in your system, and there certainly were in the Sea-King accident, and they're people that you need to know and understand. So for me, I know this is a little getting a little old now, it's getting a little dated, but it still works for me. So I reckon this is Tomo, Simo, Davo, Jenko and Brownie. Now, one RAR tells me that's Jay. So I don't know if Jay's in the room. I apologise, Jay, if you're here, but it's Jay apparently. He's served in one RAR. So these, respectfully, advanced primates, because I am one too, are trying to figure out what this advanced primate is rewarding and punishing. And frankly, I'm here to say that the Chief of Army can put out an edict or a DEFCRAN might come out, but these guys here are trying to figure out what this guy is rewarding and punishing because that's their daily life. So if this guy here is on board with us in our value system and the way that we like to do business, then we're okay. If he isn't, then we've got a problem because these advanced primates, because they want to stay connected to the group, that's a survival instinct. Separation from the group was never good for us when we were on the Savannah Plain. Once we got isolated, we didn't survive. So for us to stay with the group is really important. Look at all the way that we're all dressed here today. It's great. I'm loving it. It's blue suits are in apparently. So got to stay with the group. All right. I think also when I go out to try and clean up my garden once a year, usually what I do to try and trick my wife is I just take away all the dead stuff, right? It's all the brown stuff, I take it out, and then the garden looks like it's been done. Very little work, lazy Marty. I think she's onto it, but once I take out all the dead stuff, the place already looks a lot better. And for me, I think sometimes we are reticent as an organisation to deal with the dead wood in leadership. And I see us tolerate poor leadership behaviours far too often. And there's nothing more damaging for people, and you'll have your own experiences because it'll be coded into your memory. Remember, a threat-sensitive species. You'll have your own memories about when you've been exposed to a leader that isn't serving our purposes. There's a textbook definition of what that looks like, but the slide background is really important too. That slide background is that laissez-faire leadership, and what I've found in my investigations around loss of system control in aviation accidents that have killed many of our own people, is that there is no room for laissez-faire, she'll be right leadership. Sometimes it's dressed up as the Australian way, but I often see it as just lazy non-engagement of important leadership issues. So laissez-faire leadership is also seen as a form of destructive leadership in the psychological literature. I want to put a plug in for our fourth value, because when I see a lot of the other words around what we're talking about, I think respect encompasses a whole bunch of these things. Simply being respectful. I think smart people talk about respecting the enemy, and I think we need to respect others within our own system. Remember that blue threat thing. When we start to lose respect for our own people, we're waging a war within that we cannot afford in our system. So I think if we're encouraging and reinforcing our own language, which is respectful behaviour, and showing people what respect looks like, what disrespect looks like and its impact, and then managing that behaviour within our own system, then we're going to be much better off as an organisation. Captain Mogger spoke about normalisation of deviance, which confirms the fact, sir, that we probably should have got together and coordinated our presentations. But I'm not going to labour the point around normalisation of deviance, but it is a fact that we talk about all of the time in the aviation setting. It is our number one threat. Our number one threat is probably the number one threat, and is certainly one of the key threats that Commander 16 Brigade has in his threat matrix, is normalisation of deviance. And so really this is, as Captain Mogger said, it happens over time, it comes from informal practices. You know cultures at work when you arrive at a unit and someone says to you, forget what you learned at Singleton, forget what you learned at RMC, this is how we do things around here. And that's already a culture at play. And so that's fine, that's adaptive, as long as you're not drifting into error, which is another phrase that we use in the aviation setting. So I think there were some role clarity issues around a normalisation of deviance around these key accidents. So Captain Mogger's already mentioned the Sea-King accident, but there was a quote, November 04 minute, a quote from the CO of the unit 817 Squadron at the time to the Maritime Commander, I think we've developed a culture of shortcuts and workarounds in maintenance. And so that was the number one problem, that CO, who happened to be there in a space and time, the antecedents to that accident had been set up in the 80s. And so he happened to be there in a space and time and had to wear the consequences around that. Black Hawk 221 was mentioned a bit earlier today, HMS Kanimbla. As an organisation, Army Aviation had normalised the concept of rotor droop. Rotor droop was essentially allowing the aircraft to go out of its published limitations from the manufacturer to create a tactical effect of speed to the target. And so at a particular stage, and putting it roughly, the aircraft wasn't flying for a period of time. And then there was a recovery piece to get the aircraft back into flying mode again. That poor old Mark Bingley and Joshua Porter suffered at the hands of when they couldn't recover it. We were way out there and beyond the risk curve. We were well outside the box there. But we as an organisation, role clarity and leadership, had allowed that to develop, that deviance. And the Chinook Afghanistan, Marcus Case died in that crash iteration. He was riding the ramp at the time and was ejected out of the back of the aircraft on a tether that didn't keep him contained in the aircraft. We had normalised ramp riding as a thing to give to people as rewards. We justified it in various and many ways, but it was reasonably clear that the policy was that passengers were to sit in a seat with a harness on. So the argument was that Marcus Case should never have been on that ramp, but we had normalised the deviance of ramp riding quite significantly in some cases. At one stage, during a farewell for a CO, the CO and his family rode the ramp as a farewell. I'm just glad that they didn't get a pitch oscillation event during that, because they would have been in serious trouble. So as an organisation, we'd normalise the deviance as well. So for me, leadership clarity is around, you saw the Venn diagram, it's around managing the boundaries and making sure that things don't fall through in those boundaries. Because if there's confusion at the boundary, you might find out that nobody's done it, and that creates a big hole in your cheese. It's about understanding accountability, so that when we have leadership clarity, what are you accountable for in terms of this system? The ability to identify threats, often around those edges and margins, where a lot of expertise will come in, and the ability to understand why. One of the themes of the Sea-King accident was that a lot of people in the system didn't understand why they did their job. And I think leaders need to have an obligation. They have an obligation to explain why people do their job, because if they understand why, they're more likely to comply. Sometimes I have to remind people in our system that we're all agents of the Commonwealth, that we have obligations under law to observe the law of and procedures of our system. And then when we're drifting, one way to understand drift and to detect drift is to have standards in the first place, and then to audit against those standards. And if anyone's operated in the aviation airworthiness system, it is a complex and very solid system of standard setting and then auditing against those standards on a regular basis, because we're very conscious of the drift that can occur. A lot of drift comes from people not having resources. So self-correcting teams can self-correct if they have the time, the white space to reflect and to correct. If we're just on the go all of the time, we just keep going and going and going and reflect and not correct and drift, and then we might end up with Jason Chalice. And so they should be, and that we shouldn't get to that point, but they should be sentinel markers for us to ensure that we've got a system of reflection and double loop decision making. This is then Captain Dave Burke. Dave Burke's just retired from the Army as a full colonel. His last job was the DA in Pakistan. This is a grab from the Four Corners episode around the Black Hawk 96 crash. He's one of the surviving pilots from the two aircraft that crashed and killed 18 Defence Force personnel on the 12th of June, 96. When he was asked about all of the things that had been lined up in front of him, the Swiss cheese, if you will, had been shown to him through the process of the interview, he said, "Look, I know you've put that before me, but when I look back, no one thing stood out." And so this is why we need separate agencies, separate eyes on, and processes for review to protect Dave Burke and everyone out there doing the job, and to prevent the terrible losses that we've experienced too many times in our system. This is the footage from Black Hawk 221 on the back of HMAS Kanimbla, the moment of impact. The principal finding from the Board of Inquiry was that it was pilot error, but I want you to have a look at and these are the words taken straight from the BOI report. Uncontrolled, inadequately supervised and unnoticed evolution of normalised deviance coupled with an unchecked level of complacency. Now, I personally don't agree with the complacency bit. There was nothing complacent about that squadron or that capability. They were trying to do the job as best they could. But there was certainly the supervisory system, the clarity around our role to supervise and lead that system in the higher parts of the organisation failed those people, in my view. This pilot, who's a witness before the Board of Inquiry at the time, a young pilot, part of the culture, caught up in it, trying to do the best they can, going hard at it, developing capability and outcomes for the client. On special operations, we're often on the edge of the performance envelope. In actuality, in reality, they were beyond the performance envelope of the helicopter. That was demonstrable. You could see that on a graph. In fact, the helicopter, alarms and bells would go off saying, "You are now in rotordroop, you need to recover." It was a normalised way of doing business to create the speed effect. If he's talking about the capability around the human, I've been a psychologist for 30 years and I can't predict that. So they were trading safety for speed. This guy, Jerry Fogarty, Lieutenant Colonel, previously in the Army Reserve, Emeritus Professor at USQ, he tells us that in terms of violation behaviour, the group norm is very powerful, but management attitude and leadership is just as powerful in avoiding violation behaviour. So my question is, how are we managing this and how are we monitoring this in our system? In Army Aviation, just quickly, we run an annual snapshot culture survey. That's kind of what it looks like. So we are testing the water in terms of leadership, supervision, climate, and a whole bunch of other things. And it is sensitive to change. And so we can identify units that are moving towards a drift or moving towards some more significant problems. Non-technical skills are trained to all aircrew, pilots and air crewmen, and all maintainers in the ADF aviation system. And you can see there the table of contents, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. It's a 2.5-day course with updates every 2 or 3 years. And finally, I've done some work around the place using the strength deployment inventory. This is relationships awareness theory, people, process and productivity. Where are your preferences? Where are the people in your team? How do you operate when things are going well? How do you operate the arrowheads when things aren't going so well? Does your relationship style or preference change? And we've done some, I think we did about 40 officers in 7 Brigade earlier this year. CTC's done some work, and we do some within aviation as well. So that's the sort of thing that we're doing. We're about to trial the 5 choices, Covey Institute 5 choices model with our senior maintainers at 5 Aviation Regiment at the end of this month. So I think this is a really important model. I think the definition's good. I think you can argue about the edges, but role clarity is absolutely necessary to assist self-correcting teams and organisations. Thank you for your time.